For our fourth lesson in Unit 1, we're going to mainly focus on properties, but we're also going to take an extra little look at some collecting terms together. Now, most of the collecting terms questions we looked at last time had parentheses involved, so our grouping elements. And a different way you can approach this is to actually distribute, which is one thing we're going to talk about actually when we go to our properties. And distribute actually means you're going to multiply out. Now this one's a fairly simple one to multiply out, and actually what we're going to do is we're just going to use our rules of positive and negative numbers. So this one just says we're going to add 5a, which is just plus 5a. Now some of you will know from when you add negative numbers that if you add a negative number, it just simply becomes a negative. And some of you might also remember the rule that if you have two negatives, it makes a positive. What that rule is really saying is if you subtract a negative, it becomes a positive. And certainly if you only have one negative sign out of these two, then this should become negative. So what we just did there is we actually just distributed. We got rid of the parentheses and we multiplied out. Now once it's written like this, I think it's a lot easier to actually collect terms together. So I can see that this term here goes with this term here, and I can actually add these together. So 3a plus 5a is 8a. Now also we want to do our highest powers first, so I'm just changing the order here. And this is called standard form. So my answer for this question then is positive 2a squared, or just 2a squared. 3a plus 5a is 8a. And then the last term we have is just take away 7b. So I can put subtract 7b. So also one of the other rules I just used here is I changed the order in which I did the question. Originally the question was in this order here. And when we group terms we're allowed to do that. And this is actually one of the rules we're going to talk about today. This is actually called the commutative rule. When you add terms, you can actually add them in any order that you like. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now we've got to be very careful though when we have a subtract in front of the grouping symbol. We're still going to do the same idea. Now the first one, it just says subtract 5b, so we're okay here. On the last term here though, we're subtracting a negative, and those two negatives together, in this case, give us a positive. Now when it comes to grouping things, let's see if there are any like terms here. Well, certainly the b squareds are like terms. And actually, so are the b's here. Now ideally I'd like to do, my squared terms first, and then I'd like to do my non-squared terms second. So 7b squared plus 2b squared should be 9b squared, and 4b take away 5b is negative 1b, so with it being a negative, I put subtract, and also remember when it's just one of a variable, we don't write the number 1, so that would be my answer. Now we also then tried a few more of these in class, so if you didn't finish off your worksheet last time, take a look at that as well. And let's take a look at properties. Now you've got, I believe, it's about 10 to 15 properties that you have to learn. And this is what they look like. And also I'm going to try and add a little bit more meaning to this. So associative, it says for this one, a plus b plus c equals a plus b plus c. And notice the grouping is in a different position. So that means that you can add numbers together in any order that you like. Now, to help me remember these as well, I actually started writing down in words what they actually are. So for associative, it's the same position for different groupings. So ABC, ABC, but the parentheses move. Now this also works for multiplication as well. ABC, ABC. And if you want convincing of that, just think of a few numbers. This one, you'd do the grouping first, which would give you 5, plus 4 is 9. If you did this one, did the grouping first, you'd get 7, and 2 plus 7 is 9. So indeed, it doesn't matter which order that you add numbers together or multiply numbers together. Now, our next property is the commutative property, and that's actually one we just looked at when we were collecting terms. The order changes, but you still get the same answer. So it doesn't matter in which order you add two numbers together or which order you multiply two numbers together, you still get the same answer. So 2 times 5 is 10, but 5 times 2 is also 10. So we're allowed to change the order if it's addition or if it's multiplication. Next one is identity. And the identity says a plus 0 is just a. So in other words, adding 0 doesn't do anything. Or if you times something by 1, you get the number that you started with, which is a. So for me, identity, it changes nothing. It doesn't do anything. Inverse? Inverse is really the opposite. If I said do the inverse operation, So if you have a positive a, then the inverse is to subtract a. If you're times something by a, then the opposite is to divide by a. So you're looking for things that are exact opposites. Another example would be if something was squared, you did a square root. That would be an opposite. Distributive was one we just talked about in the earlier section as well. And that's when you multiply things out. And the example for this one here is like this. What you would say is you'd say a times b, which is just ab, and then a times c, which is ac. So it's just a simple multiplication. Now our second page of properties. Multiplicative property of 0, fairly easy one to remember. If you times by 0, the answer is 0, so that's a really easy one to remember. Reflexive property, this one always seems a very strange one and a very obvious one to me. Any number is equal to itself. So a equals a, 10 equals 10, 3 equals 3, etc, etc. Symmetric is one we're going to use when we come to solving equations. And that's if you've got the left-hand side of something equals the right-hand side of something, then you can switch the two sides over. The right-hand side would equal the left-hand side. And they show that up here by saying if a equals b, then b equals a. Now a lot of people get this property mixed up and think it's the commutative rule because things change places. There is a big difference on this question. Notice that we have two equal signs. And if I go back to the previous one, for my commutative rule, notice I only have one equal sign. So there's a little clue that you can use to try and help yourself remember which is which. But symmetric is when you switch the left and the right hand sides over. Transitive, this is when there's three properties together. Basically it says A implies B, B implies C, and then A implies C. So I always look for three things, and I'm trying to emphasize the T's here, because transitive also starts with T. So if I told you my cat is Jess, and I told you that Jess is 6 years old, you know that my cat is 6 years old. Okay, the first thing I had was cat, that's like my A. Jess is like B, so I got Jess, B again. 6, how old she is C. And then look on the last statement here, cat was originally my statement A, 6 years old was statement C. So if I tell you A tells you about B, and B tells you about C, then A tells you about C as well. And that's what it says there. Now it says equals for this one, it could also be greater than as well, or it could be less than as well, would also work for this. Now our third one of properties, this looks like a lot, but these are actually all the same. The properties of equality, and we haven't done solving equations yet, but hopefully you remember some of this from pre-algebra. What you do to one side of an equation, you must do to the other side as well. So if you add a number to one side, you must add it to the other side. If you subtract a number from one side, you must subtract from the other side. So depending on what you're actually doing here, so if this is adding, this would be the addition property of equality. If you multiply both sides by a certain letter, that would be the multiplication property of equality. So a fairly easy one to spot, I think. And the last one is the substitution property. I originally learnt this as the closure property, and I'm just going to write that down up here as well. When I used to teach Algebra 2, we seem to be going back to the substitution property. And a substitution is when you replace something with something else. And this is basically when you do a simple calculation, you work out what a number actually is. So 6 plus 4 is 10. I substituted where it said 6 plus 4, I'm going to write down 10. So any basic math calculations that you do, you're going to use the substitution property. The only exceptions are unless it's another property. So for something like this, although I worked out what is 3 plus 0, this one is going to be my identity property because I started with something and then nothing changed at the end. So you do have to be a little bit careful with this. Or if I said this one, 3 times 0 is 0. You did work out an answer, but actually this is the multiplicative property of 0. So keep an eye out for those special ones, but that would be substitution. Now it comes back to going back and learning all these ones, so keep looking through, practice as many questions as you can, start to familiarise yourself with these rules, and we'll also be using these rules in our very next chapter too. So we've got 6 rules here, 5 rules here, that's 11, equality is 12, and substitution is 13. So it is quite a bit of work. Make sure you spend time regularly looking over those to make sure you familiarise yourself with the correct terms.